We're going to go straight to our second speaker now, and welcome before Steve McAlpine. Thanks so much, Steve, for joining us from Perth, and we look forward to you speaking about how to live for Jesus in a world that says you shouldn't. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks heaps. Great to be with you guys today. I've put together a bit of a slideshow, so I'll go through that for you in a minute and put it on screen share in a minute. If you can see it, I'm not sure, but if not, I'll sort that out for you. Yeah, really good to be with you. I've written this book, obviously, which is, you might have a copy of it. I don't know if you do, Being the Bad Guys. But what I wanted to do in this book and what I want to do today is unpack why that a whole issue of where we're at in the culture and why it's actually pushing back on us so hard at the moment, and why it seems like we don't have much traction to be able to do anything about it. And so one of the things I did in my book as I was writing it was say, why does it seem that the way we're talking about the gospel is being mirrored by a conversation about sexuality that seems to be a gospel conversation as well? It feels like, as I've been saying, that we've got competing visions of the gospel. We've got things happening where, I don't know if you can see the screen, I'm not sure if you can, we're actually experiencing a clash of two gospels. And in this clash of two gospels, what we're experiencing is the language and the way we talk about the gospel is being mirrored by the cultural framework. And one of the things that I've said is that gender identity, because of the way it's been shaped in our culture, because of the last 40 or 50 years of the sexual revolution, is now almost the most important reality about the self. It's central to what I call a new secular religion. So when you see the experiences that you're having in Victoria at the moment, what you're getting is not the gospel's coming in to speak to something neutral, but the gospel is coming in to clash with another gospel. And I think that's what makes this topic such a hot topic at the moment. One of the things that happened during the same-sex marriage debate of a few years ago was that Christians came in thinking they were going to be able to deal with same-sex marriage as sort of a neutral issue to the side, that we were Christians and of course we love you, but we don't agree with you. And, you know, sexuality is a sort of side issue to what's going on in the culture. And the answer was, no. That is exactly the wrong way to look at it. The sexuality debate is central to who people view themselves as. The issue of marriage is central to our understanding of identity. And the heat that Christians received on that topic was so huge. They were discombobulated. They didn't realize that what they were doing was actually just, you know, causing more heat by clashing with someone else's gospel. And I think that was a critical point to it. I don't seem to be able to screen share at the moment, so I'm not sure what's happening there, but I'll talk through what I'm doing anyway. Here we go. I might be able to get this up and running in a second. Let's see. But part of the issue for me was how do you actually discuss this in such a way that you can have a conversation with someone about what's going on? And here we go. I'll get to this one. Gender identity, I say, is now the deepest, most important reality about the self, central to the new secular religion. And one of the things about that was, as I went on, I was looking at how people discuss this religious question, and I came to Ros Ward, who was the head of the Safe Schools Coalition. And I noticed she said these words in a Guardian article: "I will never give up fighting for a more free and joyful world." And I suddenly realized that at that point, the very language and direction of where we're going into the future had been hijacked in some senses. The words free and joyful. And I thought, those are our words. Those are the words that Christians use about where we're heading. We're heading towards freedom and joy. And suddenly we realized we weren't the only people with those words on our lips. We weren't the only people who had a vision of human flourishing. And the vision of human flourishing that was being put forward by this, what I call the secular age, was in complete opposition to what we were saying. And not only that, Christianity was no longer seen as a viable alternative, an alternative strategy for human flourishing in our culture. It was suddenly seen as something that was opposing human flourishing. I think the time was that if you got onto Q&A, and I've never been on Q&A, and I don't imagine that I will be on Q&A on the ABC, that you wanted the most sensible Christian you could find to be on Q&A. And if you could get a sensible Christian on Q&A who said to the other panelists, look, we're all in this together. We're all got the same vision of human flourishing. We've all got the same understanding of humanity. Everyone would nod in agreement. And we would think, hey, we've won. We've got a sensible Christian who sort of slots into where the culture is headed, and that gives us credibility. That is no longer the case. If you're on Q&A today, it would be the case that you would go on there and you'd have to say, look, we have a completely different understanding of the world to you, or understanding of humanity, what humanity's for, where we're headed. They're completely different. If you're on Q&A today, the trick would be to say how different we are to you, because we just don't have the same direction. Sure, we may use the same language to describe things, but we mean different things by that language. And that's key to understanding what I was writing about in my book. That Christians are coming into a place where they're going, I don't understand the landscape anymore. I feel like I'm well out of understanding what life's about in this current setting, especially on this sexuality issue in particular. And so when I listen to the Victorian government talking about sex and gender and all the conversion therapy stuff, what you're hearing very much is, behind us, we had a hell that we had to live in, but forward, there is a free and joyful world towards which we are going. And that's a competing narrative to what we actually think as Christians. It can't be co-opted. It can't run parallel. It's in competition. And at least in one sense, the Victorian government is acknowledging that, what we've known all along. They're just legislating that it's in opposition to us. One of the things I tried to discover too, as I was reading the book, is where is this going to head as we go into the future? And there was a really interesting article in Vice magazine of this person here, Caitlyn Jenner. And it's such a cracking line that was put in this magazine. It says, the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, once in every American generation comes a moment that changes the world forever. For millennials, that moment came last night. In other words, the moment that came for millennials to see a generational change or change in culture was Bruce Jenner coming out as Caitlyn Jenner. Bruce Jenner becoming Caitlyn Jenner, a man now identifying as a woman. And as you think about it, that's a big call, isn't it? The moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and Bruce Jenner. I'm not sure how history will judge that in the future as the great moment. But for millennials, it's important. And here's why. The moon landing is a very baby boomer issue, I think. There's something, truth is out there, if you can remember the X-Files. Truth is out there. The moon landing was our stretch upward to search for who we were and to find something about ourselves by going outwards and by looking up. The moon landing. And then I'm old enough to remember the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. That was a very X-generation thing that suddenly, if we're going to find anything about ourselves, it's going to be with the walls broken down and a wide community. So it went from looking for truth up there, we'd stop landing on the moon, to tearing down the walls down here, across. We're going to look for truth across us as a community. Now, we know that community is fractured in a huge way. For many reasons. And there's a deep individualism at play at the moment as well. Those days of standing on the Berlin Wall rejoicing together seem to be long behind us. What we have is the search for who I authentically am is within. So you can see why, even though you look at that picture and think that's silly, how can that be like the moon landing or the fall of the Berlin Wall? For the millennial, in a world where institutions are failing them, where things are not happening the way they thought, where technology is letting them down, technology itself has turned to an individualistic autonomy. It's pushing us within ourselves. And for millennials, the search for the true self has come to looking within, deeply within. Now, that's not just true of millennials, but it's going at a fast pace. So you can see that Bruce Jenner in 1976 was a key player in, he was the pinnacle of manhood at the 1976 Olympics, where he won gold in Montreal for the decathlon, the pinnacle of man. This photo was taken in 2016. 40 years later, the person who was the pinnacle of manhood in 1976 is presented in Vanity Fair magazine as the pinnacle of womanhood and was Woman of the Year. The same person was able to loose the surly bonds of their own identity and change themselves so much that they would be Man of the Year and Woman of the Year in the same lifetime, the same person. That is a huge shift of thinking. And it shows you that what's going on with the whole sexuality debate is so deeply ingrained that to touch on it or to question it is seen as violence. It's a violent act towards someone. So I think that's why Christians are now being seen as the bad guys. There's something about the way we're talking about sexuality that is seen as unsafe. It's seen not just as wrong, but dangerous, because it's touching on the core of who I want to be, how I want to liberate myself. I think that's why so much of our apologetics around this issue has lost traction. We just haven't figured out that we're speaking into another gospel. We're assuming a neutral space when we talk about sexuality, and that neutral space is no longer there. So that's crucial to understanding why there's so much heat in the whole debate. The other thing I'd say is this is a set of stamps that came out a year after the same-sex marriage vote in Australia. These set of stamps, love is love and marriage equality. And one of the things that's driving so much of what we're dealing with across the whole sexuality debate in Australia, and particularly in Victoria at the moment, is that love looks good, love looks good. And the aesthetic is so important in this setting. We'll talk a little bit about aesthetics in a moment. But the cultural framework is such that culture, politics, law, business has been co-opted to create, as Mark Sayers would say, sort of this shiny apocalypse of a future that we're heading towards, where everything is so shiny and bright and beautiful. So when you see love is love and marriage equality stamps on your letters, even down to the little things in our lives, everything has been twisted to paint this beautiful picture of what is going on in our culture with sexuality. It's a massive statement to our culture that love actually looks good. And so when you're having a debate about these issues, it wasn't so much that you could, like Granny, who's maybe 80 years of age, she was never into all this sexuality stuff, and it was a bit yucky, this same-sex stuff, until, of course, her nephew comes out as gay, and he's got a beautiful boyfriend, and they're lovely, and they have dinner together with Granny. The whole thing was moved, the whole issue around sexuality was set up to be shaped by aesthetics, not ethics as such, because the ethic behind our culture was very different to the Christian ethic. We didn't recognize that quickly. We didn't realize how quickly things had fallen away. So even in the same-sex marriage debate, as I was reading it, people were still thinking that the no vote could win. I just couldn't see how that was entirely possible to think that. But part of that was because we thought that the ethics under it all was firm in our culture, that somehow people would default to an ethical understanding of marriage that was traditional. The fact is they did take an ethical view of marriage. It was just a very different ethic. It was to say that everyone is equal, everyone can have this thing called marriage, and to say otherwise is in fact unethical. And I think that was critical in the whole situation. And as I've written in my book, it's very confusing for Christians coming into places where they assume that their view of marriage or their view of sexuality will come into a neutral space. I'm old enough to have done postmodern lit degree back in the 80s. And back at university in those days, the sense was that it's a marketplace of ideas. Any overarching statement about what is true and right is just a power play. And so everything is open to the market. That hasn't proven to be true. It's proven to be that the Christian framework in particular has been seen as found wanting and has been junked. So we've come into this future 30 odd years later after that sort of mid-80s whole postmodern experience at university and realized that it is not an open public square. It is not an open marketplace to ideas. This idea around what love is and how it works is now seen as the only option you can take without being seen as recalcitrant. Good Paul Keating word there. He taught us all that back in the early 90s, I think. Recalcitrant. One of the keys, though, that I think is most disconcerting for many Christians is just exactly how often this has taken Christians. It's in the church. It feels very strongly that, and this is something I write about, that if you're a Christian who holds to a traditional Orthodox understanding of sexuality and you exist near a church that doesn't, that church would never back up your church if in a bun fight with the state government. What I mean by that is your sexual ethic, if it's Orthodox, people in other churches who have a revisionist view of sexuality would never see you as a brother or a sister, despite that difference. They would always see you as opposing what is true and right and what Jesus would want. And that makes it very difficult, because I think there will be churches that will be, dobbing other churches in and saying to state governments, this is how these churches will hide their understanding of sexuality, or hide their understanding of marriage or anything to do with sexuality and gender beneath theological terminology. So I think there will be plenty of people co-opted by the government to suss out Orthodox theology in churches. And that's where I come to Josh Harris, because what I've realized as Josh Harris, who wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye, actually left the Christian faith. And one of the things that's most disconcerting for many Christians is as people have left Christianity, Orthodox traditional understandings of Christianity, they've been embraced warmly by a wider culture. If you left Christianity and became sort of heretical 400, 500 years ago, life was fairly bleak. Life would be quite lonesome for you. You would be sort of exiled from your community. But as Christians fall away from Orthodox understanding of sexuality, they are embraced by a very beautiful, kind community. It's almost a conversion experience itself. Once I was blind, says Josh Harris, but now I can see. And when Josh Harris left behind the faith, he posted this picture on Instagram the next day, talking about his fall away. And it's a great picture, as I said. It's a salvation story, a secular salvation story. We see a new man, a new creation, standing before a pristine environment, ready to launch out onto a new venture. Here is Adam, fresh, clean, ready for the next stage. So whatever happens with the sexuality story, when someone decides to jump ship from Orthodox thinking around it and move into a revisionist view or leave Christianity behind for their sexuality, what you end up getting is this salvation narrative and an embrace by the wider culture, and then a comment, and why can't the rest of you see this as well? Now, I'll make one point. The new Adam doesn't have much hair, so I assume that is a most glorious way to be. But it was interesting, the follow-up Instagram from Josh Harris pretty much the next day or a couple of days later was Josh Harris there eating this rainbow cake at a pride parade. And what you see at this was that the same person who was discipling people into one area of life in his previous past, whether that was the healthiest way to do it with his I Kissed Dating Goodbye book, now has a new discipling program. And this new religious reality is offering a kind of post-Christian disciple program that directly challenges the authoritative claims of the gospel. And it does so with such an alluring aesthetic that it will even draw some away from within the church, anyone not grounded in cross-shaped gospel of Jesus. So you see that the discipleship program of the wider culture is very alluring. And I would say, don't be surprised if you don't do a thick gospel community discipleship program among your young people, your millennials, that though they would publicly assent to what we believe as Christians, privately, they look at the Josh Harris experience and say, why can't it be like that? Don't be surprised if we haven't got to their hearts, if we haven't got a good, thick community discipleship program that offers Jesus as a better way. And I think that's the thing. We're so surprised at how young people are perhaps falling away on this one. not just young people, but in particular, young people. Someone I know who's a young pastor who didn't grow up in a Christian family and is now pastoring said he's never had the yuck factor about the sexuality issue or homosexuality as many older generations of people did, even those who weren't Christians. He said, there's been no yuck factor about same-sex sex in my upbringing. Now I have to showcase Christian sexuality from almost neutral territory. I can't bank on people going, "Ew, that's wrong. What's right?" I just have to say, here's the gospel. Here's what it says about sexuality. That's the new territory we are in. We can't assume that the aesthetic has been able to, that we can dampen down the aesthetic that's coming our way with sexuality. That's one of the issues why I think we're the bad guys. We're seen as a little bit grumpy or quite unsafe. And we're seen as those who have abandoned any idea of looking for something good in our culture. And we're retrograde in many ways. So that seems like a really, is there any way back from this? It's very hard to see a way back in the near future, especially as legislations come in. And here in Western Australia, our Labor Party, who is in power at the moment, is about to steamroller the next election this coming Saturday. And there will be as little as 7 opposition MPs in Parliament. And the Premier, Mark McGowan, has already indicated that they're going to look at the Victorian model very closely and bring that in as something in very similar to that on these same issues. So it's very interesting that Mark McGowan is seen as a conservative in many respects. He's quite a typical West Australian. He's not actually West Australian, but he's got that sort of very family-oriented man, very business-oriented man. Yet on sexuality, it's going to be quite radical. And that's what we're going to find across the place, that it isn't just those who hold to sort of wacky Marxist revolutionary ideas like perhaps Ros Ward does. It's going to be the businessman premier of a state whose biggest commodity is iron ore is going to be the person who's pushing this into our culture. Is there a chink in the armor? I think perhaps there is a little bit of a chink in the armor because actually, funnily enough, around the issue of abortion. Now, Carl Trueman says that we need to win the aesthetic, not the argument, when it comes to issues around morality at the moment, because we've lost the argument because we've lost the aesthetic. But he said on the issue of abortion, you would think that after 60 years of abortion rights and a huge push in the culture to be very pro-abortion, that most people who are younger coming through are very pro-abortion. But the stats don't show that as much. The stats show that people are a little bit more circumspect about abortion compared to what they used to be. The fact that there's still a strong push against abortion in the secular frame and an increasing one is indicative that something has shifted. And Carl Trueman said it was the advance and the rise of high-resolution technologies which allow us to see into the womb in a way that we never could before. He said the aesthetic of seeing a young child in 3D image in a womb suddenly made people pause and think, wow, there's something more going on in that womb than I had ever imagined. And I remember the sex education classes in the 1970s where we were told it was just a blob in a womb. You look at these photos on the screen and you realize that is not a blob in a womb. There's something going on. And Carl Trueman said, the aesthetic is what wins the argument around ethics at the moment. So the same-sex issue is beautiful. The stamps are beautiful that come on your letters. The pride parades are beautiful. The pictures are beautiful. The programs on the culture are beautiful. That's the aesthetic. And it's very difficult to find a way to counter that aesthetic. But he said it has happened with the abortion debate. But he does go on to say that, and there's ever proof that aesthetics are going to win the debate. It's not Carl Trueman, is it? He said it's very hard to see where traditionalists might seize the aesthetic advantage in the debates over sexuality and identity. It will be very hard to gain a narrative advantage for traditional positions. Not only do we not have significant access to pop culture media, we must also acknowledge that for every narrated story of a broken gay marriage or family, there will be just as many, if not more, from traditional marriages and families. I think Carl's right. I can't see the place where we have an aesthetic that's public at the moment that could counter the same-sex or gender identity aesthetic. It's just not there in the culture. And the popular culture media has been captured by that side of the debate. And as Mark Sayers says, the problem is the zombie apocalypse that we all want, where there'll be societal collapse, hasn't really happened on sexuality and gender at this stage. We're predicting it all the time, but it still looks bright and shiny. It still looks like things are going well. And Sayers puts it memorably and brilliantly when he says, it hasn't happened yet. What has happened is that mum is sitting reading on her Kindle. She's reading 50 Shades of Grey. Dad's downstairs in the den having a sneaky look at porn on his iPhone. And both mum and dad go to bed early so they can get the twins to soccer in the morning. In other words, this societal collapse that we said would come through the collapse of sexual norms and marriage and gender issues is just not happening at the moment. It all seems like things are trucking along quite fine. I would have to say to us, the tide hasn't gone out fully yet. The zombie apocalypse of post-Christian societal breakdown has not occurred. Our story appears to lack plausibility. And I think that's the crunch moment we're in at the moment. The tide isn't yet fully out. This thing hasn't bottomed out. And I would say that the Victorian legislation is just the start of that process. So we might have to settle in for the next couple of decades. What's going on? Our story seems to lack plausibility. But I would have to say to us, the church itself, the way we are as God's people, is going to be our plausibility structure going into the future. I don't think that we have another aesthetic available to us other than the church. I do think that's critical to understand. I don't think there's an equivalent for same-sex marriage as high-resolution imagery on the abortion debate. It's just not there. There's not going to be any killer app that's going to sort this out for us and show that we are actually right about sexuality and it's more beautiful. There's no killer app. But I think there is the church and the way the church lives together. Because what I'm experiencing is that the church is going through a churn at the moment anyway. Perhaps God is trying to shape us and change us to be more like him, do you think, as a church? And perhaps the way we live as community together, and you read the writings of Rosaria Butterfield or Sam Albury on this, is going to showcase to a very atomized individual world that it's pulling all the levers to try and get things to work, but they're not actually working for them. So Dale Kuhn in his book, Sex in the I World, says that despite all of the great gains apparently in the culture of the sexual revolution, two key factors are crushing our community, and that's loneliness and anxiety. We are beset with loneliness in our culture and anxiety. 30% of Australians live alone, but the anxiety tsunami is going to come rushing back over the next decade or so as loneliness, insecurity start to take their grip. Indeed, our psychologists are booked out, and COVID-19 hasn't exactly helped that. So the tide isn't fully out, but I do think that churches have the opportunity now to present themselves as an alternate ethical community that shows what true love, true forgiveness looks like. Because at the same time we're going through this love is love community, we live in a very unforgiving community. Even people like Douglas Murray, who is himself gay and an atheist, says the church itself is the place Christianity offers forgiveness in a way that the rest of the culture can't. There must be something going on if non-Christians are looking at the church and saying, there's something there that is missing from the culture. Perhaps that's what we need. I would say that the next 15 to 20 years, we might find that there's a whole bunch of cultural refugees heading our way. That people who've tried it all, done it all, are going to arrive on our shores and say, do you have anything for me? Do you have anything outside this veneer of love is love, this aesthetic that's hiding an ethic that in the end isn't working for me? And I'd hope that the church is able to say, we do things differently here. The worst thing that you're going to get is if someone lands on our shores, tired, exhausted, worn out from that individualism, worn out from the sexual pursuit that will never satisfy them, and says to us, how do you do sexuality? And we go, just the same way you do. They will walk away from our door in despair. But if they come into a community that can accept them in their brokenness and where things are at for them, and if they can come into a community where they say forgiveness and love and community for those who are different, I think that's going to be a strong case that even though we are seen as the bad guys all of the time, even though we are seen as those in the culture who are in the unsafe people, that they will look at us and say, actually, this is a place I want to be. These are the good guys, and this is a good, wholesome, safe place for us to be. So that's my prayer. I don't think it'll happen quickly, but I think hold our nerve, don't blink. I think that's where things will head in the long term. Thanks very much. That's pretty much what it is. If you want a copy of my book, it seems impossible to get at Coorong, but you can order it at the Good Book Company. So thanks heaps.